The call came in at 7:43 on a February morning when the mountains were still dark and the snow fell in sheets that made visibility nearly impossible. Search and rescue coordinator James Chen took the report with the practiced calm of someone who'd heard hundreds of missing person calls over 2 decades in the field. But something about this one made him pause. A woman, 28 years old, last seen 2 days prior on a hiking trail near a remote family cabin in the backcountry east of Vancouver. The boyfriend who reported her missing said she'd been acting strangely, seemed disoriented, wandered away from him during what was supposed to be a romantic birthday weekend. Chen asked the standard questions and noted the boyfriend's answers with growing unease he couldn't quite name. The details were too practiced, too carefully constructed, like a script rehearsed until it sounded natural. When Chen asked why the boyfriend had waited 48 hours to report his girlfriend missing in sub-zero temperatures, there was the briefest hesitation before the answer came. He'd thought she needed space, had walked back to the cabin on her own, was punishing him for some argument he couldn't quite remember. Only when she didn't return did he begin to worry. Chen thanked him for the information and immediately escalated the case to priority status. Something was wrong here, something beyond the usual weekend hiker who'd strayed off trail. He didn't know yet that within 6 hours they'd find a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch 3 miles from where the boyfriend claimed they'd separated. Fabric that matched the description of what the missing woman had been wearing, fabric with blood on it that suggested she'd been running. No, wandering. But that discovery was still hours away. For now, we need to go back 6 months, back to Austin, Texas, to a life that felt safe and predictable and entirely Emma Hartley's own. Emma woke most mornings to light filtering through the sheer curtains of her studio apartment in South Congress, the sounds of the city stirring beneath her second-floor window. She'd lived in this apartment for 3 years, ever since the breakup with Marcus that had been both devastating and necessary. And she'd built a life here that felt like her own, in ways nothing had before. The walls were covered with prints she'd collected from local artists, photographs she'd taken on road trips through hill country, a massive corkboard covered in color swatches and typography samples for the freelance design work that paid her bills and occasionally even thrilled her. Her morning routine was sacred and specific. Coffee first, the good beans from the roaster on East 6th, ground fresh, brewed in the French press her sister Sophie had given her for Christmas. Then a run along the hike and bike trail around Ladybird Lake, 3 miles that she'd gradually built up to over months of practice, pushing herself a little further each week until the distance that once seemed impossible became meditative and necessary. She loved Austin in the mornings before the heat settled in, loved the runners and dog walkers and kayakers already on the water, loved feeling part of a community even in solitude. At 28, Emma had learned to enjoy her own company in ways her younger self never could have imagined. After Marcus, after the months of couples therapy and tearful arguments, and the final exhausted acknowledgement that love wasn't enough when 2 people wanted entirely different futures, she'd been terrified of being alone. But alone had turned out to be peaceful. Alone had turned out to be productive. She'd doubled her client list, started teaching a design workshop at the community center, rekindled friendships that had faded during the relationship. Sophie, 3 years younger and perpetually worried about her older sister, had finally stopped asking if Emma was dating anyone, stopped sending links to articles about freezing eggs or the importance of putting yourself out there. Emma was out there, just on her own terms, and it felt good. Most Saturdays she met Sophie for breakfast at their favorite taco place, the one with the breakfast tacos that tourists somehow never found, where the owner knew their order and always gave them extra salsa verde. Sophie was a nurse at Dell Children's, worked brutal shifts, and these Saturday mornings were sacred for both of them. They'd talk about everything and nothing. Sophie's latest dating disaster, Emma's difficult client who kept requesting revisions that contradicted their own previous feedback, their parents who'd retired to Florida and called too infrequently, the trip to New Orleans they'd been planning for 2 hours and never quite booked. Emma cherished these mornings, the easy intimacy of sisterhood, the way Sophie could make her laugh until coffee came out her nose, the way they could communicate entire thoughts with just a look. It was Sophie who'd convinced Emma to try the dating app. Not seriously, Sophie had insisted, just for fun, just to see who was out there, no pressure to actually meet anyone. Emma had resisted for weeks before finally downloading it one night after too much wine and a rom-com that had left her feeling both cynical and hopeful in equal measure. She'd swiped through dozens of profiles with a kind of detached anthropological interest, noting the repetition of phrases, the carefully curated photos that all looked vaguely the same. The men holding fish, or standing on mountain peaks, or posing with dogs that may or may not have been theirs. She'd nearly deleted the app after a week when a message appeared from Daniel Rousseau. His profile was different, Or maybe Emma just wanted it to be different. The photos showed a man in his mid-30s with dark hair starting to gray at the temples, hazel eyes, a smile that looked genuine rather than performed. He was hiking in one photo, but not posing with a summit sign, just sitting on a rock looking at a view, caught mid-laugh at something off camera. Another showed him at what looked like a work site, wearing a hard hat and holding blueprints, pointing at something someone else was saying. His bio was brief and self-deprecating. Environmental consultant trying to save trees that don't know they need saving. Recently moved to Austin for a project and don't know anyone who isn't my coworker. Love hiking, terrible at cooking anything that isn't breakfast, have strong opinions about documentary films. His message to Emma referenced something specific from her profile, a mention of her favorite obscure indie band that Emma had included as a test to see who actually read profiles versus who just looked at photos. They messaged back and forth for 3 days before Daniel suggested meeting for coffee. Emma almost said no, defaulting to the safety of digital distance, but something about the way he wrote, the thoughtfulness of his questions, the way he actually listened to her answers rather than just waiting for his turn to talk, made her curious. They met on a Sunday afternoon at a coffee shop in Hyde Park, and Emma knew within the first 5 minutes that this was different from any first date she'd had before. Daniel looked exactly like his photos. No catfishing or strategic angles, and when he smiled at her across the small table, Emma felt something she'd almost forgotten was possible. Not instant love, nothing so dramatic, but genuine interest, the desire to know more. They talked for 2 hours about everything. His work in environmental consulting, specifically old-growth forest preservation, which he made fascinating even though Emma had never thought much about forestry policy. Her design work, the clients she loved and the ones who made her question her career choices. They discovered shared obsessions with true crime documentaries, though Daniel preferred the investigative journalism ones, while Emma leaned toward the psychological profiles. Both had complicated relationships with their families, loved intensely but from a distance. Both valued independence but admitted to loneliness in ways that felt vulnerable and honest. When Daniel suggested getting lunch, Emma agreed without hesitation, and lunch turned into a walk through the neighborhood. And the walk turned into sitting on a park bench watching the sunset while Daniel told her about growing up in Vancouver, the mountains and ocean, rain that he missed even, while appreciating Austin's completely different beauty. He kissed her that first night, gentle and unhurried, asking permission with his eyes before leaning in, and Emma kissed him back, feeling something click into place that she hadn't known was out of alignment. When they finally said goodbye, both reluctant to end the day, Daniel asked if he could see her again. Emma said yes before her brain could catalog all the reasons to be cautious, all the ways relationships could go wrong, all the protection she'd built around her heart over the past 2 years. Over the next 6 weeks, Daniel became woven into Emma's life with a naturalness that both thrilled and slightly unnerved her. He was in Austin for a temporary project, consulting on a development proposal that threatened protected watershed land, work that would keep him there for at least 3 months. They fell into routines that felt like something much older than 6 weeks. Dinner 3 or 4 times a week, Daniel cooking breakfast foods with surprising competence, Emma teaching him to make a decent pasta sauce. He joined her on morning runs, matching her pace without complaint, even though he could clearly run faster and longer. He met Sophie after 4 weeks, nervous in a way Emma found endearing, and Sophie had given Emma a subtle thumbs up behind his back after dinner, the highest praise her protective younger sister could offer. Daniel talked about his divorce. 3 years passed, but still tender in places. A marriage that had ended not in drama but in quiet incompatibility. His ex-wife had wanted children immediately, and Daniel had wanted to wait, to be more established, to feel ready, and by the time he felt ready, she'd moved on emotionally and eventually literally, remarrying within a year to someone who shared her timeline. He spoke about it without bitterness, taking responsibility for his own failings, and Emma appreciated the maturity, the lack of ex-wife bashing that had characterized so many men she'd dated. His parents had retired to Nova Scotia, were enjoying a quiet life by the ocean, and he visited once or twice a year, enough to maintain connection without the intensity of closer proximity. He had no siblings, described himself as naturally solitary, which was why the divorce hadn't devastated him the way it might have someone more dependent on partnership. What Emma loved most was how Daniel saw her. He asked about her design work with genuine curiosity, wanted to understand her process, celebrated when she landed a new client, commiserated when projects went sideways. He noticed when she was tired or stressed and responded not by trying to fix it, but by creating space for her to decompress. He never pressured for more of her time than she wanted to give, never made her feel guilty for maintaining her friendships and routines outside their relationship. When Marcus had complained that Emma prioritized her sister over him, Daniel seemed to understand that Sophie wasn't competition but foundation, someone who'd been there long before him and would be there long after if things didn't work out. But things were working out, better than Emma had imagined possible. After 2 months, Daniel's project timeline extended, which meant another 2 months in Austin, and Emma felt relief rather than the claustrophobia she might have expected. They'd had the talk about what they were doing, whether this was casual or something more, and Daniel had been honest in ways Emma found both scary and refreshing. He was falling for her, he'd said, which felt premature and also completely right. He knew he'd have to go back to Vancouver eventually, knew the distance would be complicated, but he wanted to figure it out with her if she wanted that too. Emma had said yes without the overthinking that usually characterized her decision-making process, and they'd navigated the following weeks with the particular intensity of people who know their time together has an expiration date. When Daniel's project finally ended and his departure back to Vancouver became real rather than theoretical, Emma felt the loss more acutely than she'd expected. They'd known each other 4 months, had been inseparable for most of that time, and the idea of going back to her studio apartment alone, to Saturday mornings without him making terrible coffee while she corrected his technique, to evening runs solo, felt genuinely painful. They promised to try long distance, scheduled video calls, made plans for Emma to visit. Daniel flew back to Vancouver on a Tuesday morning in late August, and Emma cried at the airport in a way she found embarrassing but couldn't control. The distance was harder than either of them had anticipated. The time difference was only 2 hours, but felt like more when their schedules didn't align. Daniel's work ramped up immediately upon his return. Projects that had been waiting for his attention, early morning site visits, and late evening calls with stakeholders. Emma threw herself into her freelance work, took on more clients than she probably should have, stayed busy enough that the missing him became background noise rather than constant ache. But the video calls when they managed them were good, really good, and Emma started to believe this might actually work. She visited Vancouver for the first time in October, a long weekend that Daniel had meticulously planned. He picked her up at the airport with flowers, drove her through the city pointing out landmarks with the pride of someone showing off their home to someone they hoped would love it too. His apartment in Kitsilano was beautiful, hardwood floors and large windows with mountain views that took Emma's breath away. They hiked Grouse Mountain, walked the seawall, ate dinner overlooking English Bay, and Emma fell in love with the city almost as much as she was falling in love with Daniel. He introduced her to colleagues, showed her his favorite coffee shops, took her to a hidden beach locals knew about, and Emma started to imagine what a life here might look like. The second visit in November was longer, 10 days over Thanksgiving, and cemented something for both of them. On the last night, over wine and the sunset view Daniel never seemed to take for granted, he told her he loved her. Not in a dramatic declaration, but simply, as fact, as something he'd been holding and now wanted her to know. He acknowledged it was fast, maybe too fast, but he couldn't imagine his future without her in it anymore, and he needed her to know that even if it scared her. Emma, surprised by her own certainty, told him she loved him too, and meant it in ways she hadn't been sure she was capable of anymore. When Emma returned to Austin after that visit, her apartment felt smaller, her life felt smaller, and she couldn't stop thinking about mountains and ocean and a man who made her feel seen. Sophie noticed immediately, asked over breakfast tacos if Emma was thinking about moving, and Emma's non-answer was answer enough. Sophie was worried, thought 4 months wasn't long enough to know someone well enough to move countries for them, reminded Emma about the importance of independence she'd worked so hard to build. Emma heard the concern and appreciated it, but also felt something she'd never felt before, a bone-deep certainty that this was right, that Daniel was worth the risk, that sometimes being practical meant missing out on something extraordinary. She started researching what it would take to move to Vancouver, work permits and visa requirements, the cost of living that made Austin look cheap in comparison. Her freelance work was mostly remote anyway. Her clients spread across different cities and time zones, and the more she thought about it, the more feasible it seemed. Daniel never pressured, in fact seemed almost hesitant to encourage her, insisted she take her time and be sure, but also sent her apartment listings in neighborhoods she might like, information about freelance networks and creative communities, contacts who might need design work. He was helping her imagine the logistics, supporting the possibility without demanding it. Emma made her decision in late December, sitting in her studio apartment on Christmas Eve, while Sophie was working a hospital shift and their parents were in Florida, and Austin felt emptier than it ever had. She could stay here in the life she'd built, safe and known and increasingly lonely, or she could take a risk on love and mountains and a future she couldn't quite picture but wanted desperately to discover. She called Daniel and told him she wanted to move to Vancouver, wanted to try building something real with him, wanted to see if the happiness she felt during visits could translate into actual life. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then told her he'd never been happier, never been more sure of anything, and they'd make it work together. Sophie was less enthusiastic but ultimately supportive, making Emma promise to stay in touch, to visit often, to leave if things didn't work out the way Emma hoped. Emma promised everything, believing she was making a choice from a place of strength rather than fear, from possibility rather than desperation. She gave notice on her apartment, consolidated her belongings into what could fit in 2 suitcases and a carry-on, said goodbye to the city that had been home for 6 years, and boarded a plane in late September, carrying her life and her hope toward a future that looked nothing like she'd planned. Everything like she wanted. The plane lifted off from Austin and Emma watched Texas disappear beneath clouds, felt equal parts terror and exhilaration, had no way of knowing that in 4 months those mountains she was flying toward, those beautiful and different mountains, would become the site of a search that would reveal everything about Daniel she'd been to and loved to see. She had no way of knowing that the man waiting for her at Vancouver International Airport with flowers and a smile was not who she thought he was, that the life she was flying toward would become a trap so subtle she wouldn't recognize it until escape seemed impossible. But that knowledge was still months away. For now, Emma looked out the window at clouds and sky and let herself believe in the kind of love that makes you brave enough to leave everything behind. The first month in Vancouver passed in a haze of newness that felt almost intoxicating. Daniel had prepared his apartment for Emma's arrival with a thoughtfulness that made her chest tight with affection. He'd cleared half his closet, bought extra hangers, placed fresh flowers on the dresser he'd emptied for her use. In the kitchen, he'd made space in cabinets that had been packed too full, organized with labels so she'd know where everything belonged. There was a new French press, the expensive kind she'd mentioned preferring, and the good coffee beans from a local roaster he'd researched specifically because their profile matched what she liked from Austin. The bathroom had new towels in the sage green she favored, toiletries she hadn't asked for but appreciated, a bathrobe hanging on the back of the door with a note that said, "For lazy Sunday mornings." Emma had stood in the apartment that first day, jet-lagged and overwhelmed, looking at all these small considerations, and felt certain she'd made the right choice. Daniel took time off work that first week to help her settle in, to show her the neighborhood, to make Vancouver feel less foreign and more like home. They walked to Kitsilano Beach and he pointed out the swimming spots locals preferred, the best place to watch sunsets, where the seals sometimes hauled out on the rocks. He took her to his favorite coffee shop where the barista knew his order and now would learn hers. They explored Granville Island Market together, Daniel buying her samples of local honey and artisan cheese, introducing her to vendors he'd known for years. He showed her the grocery store he preferred, the pharmacy, the dry cleaner, the wine shop with the owner who gave recommendations worth trusting. Every introduction felt like Daniel weaving her into the fabric of his life, making room for her in routines and relationships that predated her arrival. Emma applied for her work permit with Daniel's help, navigating the bureaucratic complexity of Canadian immigration with the confidence of someone who had support. Her freelance clients didn't care where she lived as long as the work got done, and she'd already lined up 3 new Vancouver-based clients through connections Daniel had facilitated. One was a sustainable architecture firm that needed brand identity work, another an environmental nonprofit requiring a website redesign, the third a craft brewery looking for label designs. The work was interesting and the rates were good, and Emma felt capable in ways she'd worried might be compromised by the move. She could build a professional life here, could be independent even while being partnered, could maintain the self-sufficiency she'd worked so hard to achieve after Marcus. Sophie called every few days those first weeks, wanting details, wanting reassurance that Emma was happy and safe and not making a terrible mistake. Emma told her everything, how beautiful the city was, how thoughtful Daniel had been, how right it all felt. She sent photos of mountain views and ocean walks, and the apartment that was starting to feel like theirs rather than his. Sophie listened and asked questions and tried to be supportive, even though Emma could hear the worry underneath. Sophie had never fully trusted Daniel, had said once that he seemed almost too perfect, too attentive, too good at saying exactly what Emma wanted to hear. Emma had dismissed it as protective sister syndrome, Sophie's inability to believe anyone was good enough for her. But now in Vancouver, away from Sophie's scrutinizing presence, Emma sometimes heard that concern echo in her own thoughts before she pushed it away. The second month brought routine and, with it, a different kind of settling. Daniel went back to work full-time, often leaving early for site visits and returning late after stakeholder meetings. Emma established her own rhythms, working from the apartment most days, taking breaks to explore the neighborhood, joining a yoga studio 3 blocks away where she didn't know anyone but appreciated the anonymity. She video called Sophie on Saturday mornings, maintaining their tradition even across time zones and distance, though it wasn't quite the same without breakfast tacos and Sophie's physical presence. She missed Austin more than she'd expected, missed the familiarity and the heat and the friends she'd left behind, but she also felt herself adapting, finding things to love about Vancouver, feeling less like a visitor and more like a resident. Daniel was attentive when he was home, interested in her day, supportive of her work, physically affectionate in ways that made Emma feel desired and valued. But there were also moments of distance she couldn't quite name. Times when he seemed distracted or preoccupied, when he'd check his phone repeatedly during dinner or excuse himself for work calls that lasted longer than seemed necessary. When Emma asked about it, Daniel apologized, explained that work was particularly intense right now, a contentious project with difficult stakeholders, environmental assessments that weren't going the way they should. He seemed stressed in ways she hadn't seen before, shorter-tempered occasionally, though he always caught himself and apologized when he snapped about something minor. Emma tried to be understanding, to give him space for whatever he was dealing with, but she also started to notice other small things that felt slightly off. Daniel's phone was always face down on surfaces, and he'd started taking it with him even when he went to the bathroom. His laptop required a password now when it hadn't before, and when Emma had asked casually about it, Daniel had explained that work required better security protocols, nothing personal. He'd started going to the gym at odd hours, sometimes 5 in the morning before she was awake, sometimes late at night after dinner, saying he needed to work off stress. Emma had suggested joining him and Daniel had agreed, but then always seemed to schedule his workouts when she had client calls or other commitments, almost as if he preferred going alone. She told herself she was being paranoid, that moving to a new city for a relationship was bound to create some anxiety, that she was looking for problems because part of her was scared she'd made a mistake. Daniel still told her he loved her, still made plans for their future together, still seemed invested in making the relationship work. They took a weekend trip to Tofino in late November, stayed in a cabin near the beach, and it felt like Austin again, like the early days when everything was easy and unforced. Daniel was relaxed away from Vancouver, attentive and present, making love to her with an intensity that felt almost desperate, holding her afterward like he was afraid she might disappear. Emma felt her doubts dissolve in that intimacy, felt silly for the concerns that had been accumulating, felt certain again that this was real and right and worth the risk she'd taken. But back in Vancouver, the distance returned. Daniel started working even longer hours, sometimes not coming home until after Emma had gone to bed, apologizing in the morning with coffee and explanations about deadlines and difficult clients. He seemed tired all the time, stressed in ways that manifested as withdrawal rather than communication. When Emma tried to talk about it, tried to ask if everything was okay, Daniel reassured her that work was just demanding right now, that it would calm down after the holidays, that he appreciated her patience. He'd pull her close and kiss her forehead and tell her she was the best thing in his life, and Emma would feel her concerns dissolve even as some part of her brain registered that he'd deflected rather than really answered. December brought holiday planning, and with it, a new tension. Emma had assumed she'd go back to Austin for Christmas, see Sophie and visit her parents in Florida, maintain the traditions that had defined her life before Daniel. But when she mentioned it casually over breakfast, Daniel's face had done something strange, a flicker of emotion she couldn't identify before it smoothed into understanding. Of course she should go, he'd said. He'd miss her. But he understood. He'd probably work through the holidays anyway, catch up on projects that had fallen behind. But something about the way he said it made Emma hesitate, made her feel like she was failing some test she hadn't known she was taking. She'd called Sophie to discuss travel plans, and Sophie had been thrilled, had already been planning all the things they'd do during Emma's visit, the people who wanted to see her, the restaurants they needed to go to. But as Emma listened to Sophie's excitement, she felt a strange reluctance, a pull towards staying in Vancouver with Daniel, even though he'd said he'd be working. When she mentioned this to Sophie, her sister had gone quiet in a way that meant she was choosing her words carefully. Sophie asked if Daniel had made Emma feel guilty about visiting, and Emma had immediately defended him, said no, of course not, he'd been completely supportive. But had he, though? Emma replayed the conversation and couldn't quite pin down what had bothered her about it, what had shifted her desire from going to staying. She told Sophie she'd think about it, and they'd ended the call with an awkwardness that was new between them. Emma sat in the apartment that afternoon, Daniel at work, the December rain steady against the windows, and tried to examine what she was feeling. She missed her sister desperately, missed Austin, missed the life she'd had before this leap of faith. But she also felt like leaving Daniel alone for the holidays would be abandonment somehow, would be choosing her old life over her new one in ways that felt disloyal. She couldn't articulate why she felt this way, couldn't point to anything Daniel had actually said or done to create this feeling, but it sat in her chest, heavy and confusing. When Daniel came home that night, later than he'd said he would be, Emma told him she'd decided to stay in Vancouver for Christmas. She watched his face carefully and saw relief flash across it before he controlled his expression into something more neutral. He asked if she was sure, said he didn't want her to miss her family because of him, but even as he said the words, Emma could feel that he wanted her to stay, that her staying meant something important to him. She said she was sure, that they could start their own traditions, that Sophie understood even though Sophie definitely didn't understand. Daniel had pulled her into a hug that felt almost crushing, told her he loved her, that this meant everything to him, and Emma had tried to feel good about her decision even as some small voice in her head asked why this mattered so much to him, why he needed her here so badly. She called Sophie the next day to confirm she wasn't coming, and Sophie had been quiet again, that particular sister quiet that meant disappointment and concern in equal measure. Sophie asked directly if Daniel had pressured her, and Emma said no truthfully because he hadn't, not in any way she could point to or explain. Sophie had sighed and said she hoped Emma knew what she was doing, hoped Vancouver was everything Emma wanted it to be, hoped Daniel deserved the sacrifices Emma was making. Emma had bristled at the word sacrifices, had defended her choice as exactly that, a choice she was making freely, but after they hung up the word, lingered. Was she sacrificing, or was she building? And why did it feel so hard to tell the difference? Christmas in Vancouver was beautiful and strange. Daniel had taken time off work and seemed more relaxed than he'd been in weeks, present in ways that reminded Emma why she'd fallen for him. They decorated the apartment together, cooked elaborate meals neither of them was particularly good at making, watched movies, drank too much wine, and made love with the unhurried attention of people with nowhere else to be. Daniel gave her jewelry for Christmas, a delicate necklace with a small diamond pendant that must have cost more than Emma was comfortable with, and when she protested the expense he'd looked almost hurt, said he wanted to give her beautiful things, wanted her to know how much she meant to him. She wore it and felt both cherished and slightly uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite articulate. They took walks in the rain, explored Stanley Park in winter, sat in coffee shops while storms blew through. Daniel talked about the future in concrete terms for the first time, asked Emma what she thought about maybe looking for a larger apartment together, somewhere with more space for her to work, maybe closer to the ocean. Emma felt herself getting swept up in the planning, the imagining of a life they'd built together, and for those few days it felt right again, felt like the relationship she'd moved across a continent for. Daniel mentioned casually that his parents wanted to meet her, maybe in the spring, maybe they could visit Nova Scotia together. Emma agreed, feeling nervous and excited in equal measure, another step toward permanence and commitment. New Year's Eve they spent at home, just the two of them, Daniel insisting he didn't want to share her with crowds or parties or anyone else. They watched the fireworks from the apartment balcony, wrapped in blankets against the cold, and Daniel had held her hand and told her that meeting her had changed his life, that this year with her had been the best year he could remember, that he couldn't wait to see what the next year brought them. Emma had leaned into his warmth and believed him, wanted to believe him, pushed away the small doubts that kept surfacing like debris in water, persistent and unwelcome. January brought a return to routine, and with it a shift Emma couldn't quite identify, but definitely felt. Daniel's work intensity ramped up again, or at least that's what he said, longer hours and more late nights and more time away from home. But Emma started to notice inconsistencies, small things that didn't quite add up. He'd say he was at a site visit but come home without mud on his boots, would say he'd been in meetings all day but his dress shirt wouldn't be wrinkled, would say he'd worked through lunch, but there'd be a receipt from a restaurant in his wallet when Emma was looking for grocery money. Each inconsistency alone was nothing, easily explained, but they accumulated in Emma's awareness like small stones, weighing down her certainty. She tried to dismiss her suspicions, tried to tell herself she was being crazy, that the stress of the move and the isolation of a new city were making her paranoid. She called Sophie less frequently because she didn't want to hear the concern in her sister's voice, didn't want to admit that maybe Sophie had been right to worry. Emma threw herself into work, took on more clients than was probably wise, stayed busy enough that Daniel's absences felt less stark. She made an effort to build a social life independent of him, joined a networking group for freelancers, started going to a weekly trivia night at a local pub, tried to create community in a city where she still felt like an outsider. But the doubts persisted, growing stronger even as Emma tried to push them down. Daniel's phone habits became more secretive, always tilting the screen away when a notification came through, stepping into another room for calls, clearing his browser history, which Emma only knew because she'd borrowed his laptop when hers was updating and noticed the blank slate. When she'd asked about weekend plans, Daniel had grown vague, saying he might have to work Saturday, maybe Sunday too, a project that was behind schedule and demanding his attention. Emma had suggested they needed time together, that she felt like she barely saw him anymore, and Daniel had agreed, promised they'd plan something soon, but soon never seemed to arrive. It was Sophie who finally forced the confrontation, calling on a Tuesday evening in late January when Daniel was supposedly working late again. Sophie had been uncharacteristically direct, asking Emma if she was happy, really happy, not the performance of happiness, but actual contentment. Emma had tried to say yes, had cataloged all the good things, but Sophie had cut her off mid-sentence. "You sound miserable," Sophie had said. "You sound like you're trying to convince yourself of something that isn't true, and I'm worried about you." Emma had felt something crack open in her chest, tears suddenly streaming down her face as she admitted that she didn't know she was happy, that something felt wrong but she couldn't name it, that she felt trapped and scared and stupid for feeling either of those things. Sophie had listened and then asked the question Emma had been avoiding. "Do you think he's cheating on you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Emma hadn't let herself think it explicitly, had danced around the possibility without ever landing on it, but hearing Sophie say it out loud made it real in ways that terrified her. She didn't know, she told Sophie, couldn't know without asking directly, and was afraid of what asking might reveal. Sophie had urged her to trust her instincts, reminded her that she'd ignored red flags with Marcus for too long, said that Emma had moved her entire life for this man and deserved honesty at minimum. They talked for over an hour, Emma crying and Sophie listening, and when they finally hung up, Emma felt both relief at having voiced her fears and dread at what came next. She decided to ask Daniel directly, to create space for honest conversation rather than letting suspicion poison everything. When he came home that night, later than he'd said he would be, Emma was waiting in the living room with the lights on and her resolve shaky but present. She'd asked him to sit down, had told him she needed to talk about something important, and watched his face shift through concern and confusion before landing on something that looked almost like resignation. She'd asked the question as directly as she could manage, voice shaking but clear. "Are you seeing someone else?" Daniel's reaction had been immediate and convincing. Shock first, then hurt, then a kind of bewildered denial that seemed utterly genuine. "No," he'd said. "Absolutely not. How could she even think that? Where was this coming from?" Emma had cataloged her evidence, the late nights and the inconsistencies and the phone secrecy, and Daniel had listened and then explained. Work was genuinely demanding. He was dealing with a difficult client who required evening calls across time zones. He was embarrassed about how much time his job was taking and guilty about neglecting her. The phone thing was just habit, privacy he developed during his marriage when his ex-wife had been controlling about who he talked to. The restaurant receipt was a lunch meeting he'd forgotten to mention. Every explanation was reasonable, delivered with eye contact and what seemed like total sincerity, and Emma had felt her suspicions deflate, felt foolish for letting Sophie's worry infect her own thinking. Daniel had pulled her close and apologized for making her feel neglected, promised to be more present, to prioritize their relationship over work demands, to be more transparent about his schedule. He'd asked what he could do to rebuild trust, and Emma had said she just needed him to be honest with her, to communicate rather than disappear. He'd agreed readily, had seemed almost relieved that the problem was something he could fix, and they'd gone to bed that night with Emma feeling like maybe the conversation had been necessary, maybe they'd course-corrected before real damage was done. But the next morning, while Daniel was in the shower, his phone had buzzed on the nightstand. Emma hadn't meant to look, but the preview message was visible on the lock screen, and what she saw made her blood go cold. It was from someone named Rachel. "Last night was perfect. Can't stop thinking about you." Emma had stared at the words, reading them over and over, her heart pounding so hard she thought she might be sick. She heard the shower turn off and quickly moved away from the phone, went to the kitchen on autopilot, hands shaking as she tried to make coffee. Daniel had come into the kitchen minutes later, dressed for work, kissed her forehead like nothing was wrong. Emma had forced herself to smile, to say goodbye, to wait until she heard the door close behind him before she let herself break down completely. She called Sophie from the bathroom floor, sobbing so hard she could barely speak, and told her sister everything. Sophie had been quiet and then furious, had told Emma to pack her things and come home immediately, that she'd buy Emma a plane ticket right now. But Emma couldn't move, couldn't think, could only sit on the cold bathroom tile in an apartment in a city she'd moved to for a man who was lying to her. wondering how she'd gotten everything so catastrophically wrong. Emma spent 3 days in a fog of indecision, moving through the apartment like a ghost, while Daniel went to work each morning with kisses and promises to be home for dinner. She didn't confront him about the message from Rachel. She told herself she needed more information, needed to be certain before she made accusations. But the truth was simpler and more pathetic. She was terrified of what confrontation would confirm. Instead, she watched him with new eyes, cataloging behaviors she'd explained away before, seeing patterns she'd refused to acknowledge. The way he angled his body away from her when texting, the new cologne he'd started wearing that she'd thought was for her but maybe wasn't, the gym memberships that resulted in no visible fitness changes, the work trips he mentioned casually that she realized she had no way to verify. Sophie called every few hours those first days, checking in, offering to fly to Vancouver immediately, begging Emma to just leave. But Emma couldn't explain why she stayed, couldn't articulate the paralysis that kept her in the apartment, going through motions of normalcy, while her mind spun in circles. Part of it was practical. She'd given up her Austin apartment, shipped most of her belongings, built her client base around Vancouver rates and contacts. Part of it was emotional. She'd moved her entire life for this relationship, told everyone it was the right choice, and admitting she'd been wrong felt impossible. And part of it, the part she was most ashamed of, was a desperate hope that maybe the message meant something innocent. Maybe Rachel was a colleague or a friend. Maybe Emma was overreacting and paranoid and about to destroy something real over a misunderstanding. On the 4th day, Daniel came home with flowers and a proposal for the weekend. He'd booked a cabin near Whistler, wanted to take Emma on a romantic getaway, just the two of them, a chance to reconnect like they'd talked about. He seemed excited, genuine, already planning hikes they could take and restaurants they'd try, and Emma felt her resolve waver. Maybe this was his way of making amends without knowing what he was making amends for. Maybe he'd ended whatever had been happening with Rachel and wanted to recommit to Emma. Maybe she should give him this chance, go on this trip, see if they could find their way back to what they'd had in Austin. She told Sophie about the trip, and Sophie had been horrified, had practically shouted through the phone that Emma needed to wake up, that she was being manipulated, that normal men in healthy relationships don't gaslight their girlfriends and then whisk them away to remote cabins. Emma had defended the plan, said Sophie didn't understand, that relationships were complicated and required work and forgiveness. Sophie had gone quiet, then said something that made Emma's stomach drop. "Emma, I need you to send me the address of this cabin and check in with me every day you're there. Promise me right now." The seriousness in Sophie's voice, the underlying fear, had momentarily pierced Emma's denial. But she promised and told herself her sister was being dramatic. They left for the cabin on Friday afternoon, Daniel driving his SUV through increasing snow, Emma watching the city disappear behind them and feeling a strange detachment from her own life. The cabin was beautiful. Everything Daniel had promised, tucked into trees with mountain views and a hot tub on the deck and a stone fireplace that Daniel lit while Emma unpacked their bags. He opened wine and put on music and pulled her close for a slow dance in the living room, and Emma let herself be held, let herself pretend that everything was fine, that the message from Rachel had been innocent, that her suspicions were just anxiety manifesting as sabotage. That first night was good, almost. They cooked dinner together, Daniel making her laugh with a story about a disastrous site visit, Emma feeling herself relax into the familiar rhythm of their connection. They made love in front of the fireplace with a tenderness that felt healing, and afterward Daniel held her and told her he knew he'd been distant, knew work had consumed him, knew she deserved better. He promised to make changes, to set better boundaries, to prioritize them over everything else. Emma had wanted so badly to believe him that she'd let herself, had fallen asleep in his arms feeling like maybe they could survive this rough patch, maybe her fears had been overblown. Saturday morning Daniel suggested a hike despite the snow, a trail he knew that would take them to a viewpoint with incredible vistas. Emma agreed, wanting the exercise and fresh air, wanting to feel normal and active and like a couple doing couple things. They drove to the trailhead and started hiking, the snow falling in fat flakes that made everything look pristine and otherworldly. Daniel was in good spirits, pointing out landmarks, taking photos of Emma against the white landscape, holding her hand when the trail got steep. An hour in, they reached what Daniel said was the viewpoint, though visibility was limited by the snowfall. They stood together looking out at the obscured mountains, and Daniel wrapped his arms around Emma from behind, chin on her shoulder, breath warm against her neck. "I love you," he said, and something in his voice made Emma turn to look at him. His expression was strange, intense in a way she couldn't read, and for just a moment she felt a spike of something like fear before he smiled and kissed her forehead. "I need you to know that, no matter what happens, I love you." Emma had asked what he meant by "no matter what happens," and Daniel had laughed, said nothing ominous, just that life was unpredictable and he wanted her to always remember how he felt. She'd accepted the explanation even as some animal part of her brain registered wrongness, registered danger, registered the need to pay attention. They'd started hiking back and Emma had felt increasingly uneasy, though she couldn't pinpoint why. Daniel kept checking his phone despite the lack of cell service, kept looking back the way they'd come as if watching for something. When Emma mentioned being cold and wanting to get back to the cabin, Daniel had agreed quickly, almost too quickly, and they'd picked up their pace. Back at the trailhead, there was another car parked near Daniel's that hadn't been there before, and Emma watched Daniel's eyes flick toward it and then away, jaw tightening in a way that made her stomach clench. The drive back to the cabin was quiet, Daniel claiming fatigue from the hike, Emma running through possibilities in her mind that she didn't want to name. At the cabin, Daniel suggested she take a hot bath to warm up while he started dinner. Emma had agreed and gone to the bathroom, started running water, but something made her hesitate. She turned off the water and stood listening, heard Daniel's voice low and urgent from the other room, clearly on a phone call despite having claimed there was no service. She couldn't make out words, but she could hear tone, placating and tense. And when she emerged from the bathroom, Daniel was off the phone, chopping vegetables with focused intensity. "Who was that?" Emma had asked, trying to sound casual. Daniel had looked up, confused, said, "What do you mean?" And Emma said she'd heard him on the phone. Daniel had explained that he'd gotten one bar of service briefly, had checked in with his office, nothing important. His face was open and innocent, but Emma had felt the lie like a physical thing, had felt the web of deception growing more complex, and she'd made a decision. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, she was going to look at his phone. She was going to find out who Rachel was and what was really happening. She was done with wondering and suspecting. She needed to know. Dinner was tense despite Daniel's attempts at normalcy. He asked about her work, her clients, her plans for upcoming projects, but Emma could barely focus on the conversation. Her mind was racing ahead to the night, to what she might find, to what she'd do with whatever truth she uncovered. She drank more wine than she should have, trying to calm her nerves, and Daniel kept refilling her glass, kept encouraging her to relax, kept saying she seemed stressed. Emma had wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, being told to relax by the man who was the source of all her stress, but she just nodded and drank and waited for the evening to end. They went to bed around 11, Daniel falling asleep quickly like he always did, and Emma lay awake beside him, listening to his breathing even out. She waited an hour to be safe, then carefully slid out of bed, located Daniel's phone on the nightstand, and carried it to the bathroom. Her hands were shaking as she tried to unlock it, found that the passcode had been changed from what she'd known, tried several variations before admitting defeat. She couldn't get into the phone. Whatever secrets it held would stay hidden unless she directly confronted Daniel, and she wasn't ready for that conversation in a remote cabin miles from anywhere. Emma had sat on the bathroom floor feeling defeated and stupid and so utterly alone. She was in a cabin in the woods with a man she no longer trusted. No car of her own, spotty cell service, no way to leave until Daniel decided to take her home. Sophie's fear suddenly made horrible sense. Emma pulled out her own phone and texted Sophie, "I'm okay, but I think you were right. I want to come home." The message failed to send, no service available, and Emma felt panic rising in her throat. She forced herself to breathe, to think rationally. Daniel wasn't dangerous, she told herself. He was a liar and a cheat maybe, but not violent, not threatening. She could survive the weekend, could get back to Vancouver, could pack her things and book a flight to Austin. She just had to get through the next 24 hours. She'd gone back to bed and lain awake until dawn, Daniel sleeping peacefully beside her, oblivious or uncaring about her distress. Sunday morning, he woke cheerful, suggested they make breakfast together, acted like everything was perfect between them. Emma played along, exhausted and numb, going through the motions while planning her exit strategy. They spent the day at the cabin, Daniel insisting they should enjoy the last hours, Emma counting down minutes until they could leave. She tried multiple times to send the text to Sophie, but the service remained non-existent, and with each failed attempt her anxiety grew. Finally, late Sunday afternoon, they packed up and started the drive back to Vancouver. Emma felt herself relax as they got closer to the city, to people and cell service and escape routes. Her phone buzzed with messages as service returned, multiple texts from Sophie increasingly worried, and Emma quickly sent back, "On my way home from cabin, I'm fine, we'll call soon." They were still an hour from the apartment when Daniel's phone rang. He answered on the car's Bluetooth and Emma heard a woman's voice, professional and clipped, asking for Daniel Rousseau. Daniel had quickly switched to his phone handset, saying he'd call back, but not before Emma heard the woman say something about the situation with your wife. Emma had felt the world tilt. Your wife, she'd said, and watched Daniel's hands tighten on the steering wheel. That was a work call, he'd said, but Emma was done with lies. Pull over, she'd demanded. Pull over right now and tell me the truth. Daniel had tried to keep driving, said they'd talk at home, but Emma had reached for the door handle and said she'd jump out of a moving car if he didn't stop immediately. He pulled over on the shoulder, hazards on, and turned to face her with an expression Emma had never seen before, something cold and calculating that made her blood freeze. You're married, Emma had said, statement not question. Daniel had been quiet for a long moment and then nodded. Separated, he'd said, going through a divorce. I didn't want to complicate things by telling you. But Emma was remembering now, remembering the woman at the trailhead who might have been watching them, remembering the careful way Daniel had kept Emma away from certain parts of his life, remembering the message from Rachel who might not have been an affair but a wife. Is Rachel your wife? Emma had asked, and watched confirmation flash across Daniel's face before he could control it. It's not what you think, he'd started, but Emma had stopped listening. She'd grabbed her phone and opened the door, stepping out into the February cold without a coat, starting to walk back the way they'd come. Daniel had followed, shouting for her to get back in the car, saying she was being crazy, but Emma had kept walking, desperate to put distance between them. He'd grabbed her arm and Emma had spun around, yanking free, and seen something in his eyes that made her understand Sophie's fear. This was a man capable of lying about everything, a man who'd constructed an entire false reality, and Emma had no idea what else he might be capable of. Don't touch me, she'd said, voice shaking. Don't ever touch me again. Daniel had stepped back, hands raised, face shifting into something apologetic and wounded. Emma, please let me explain, he'd said. But Emma was done with explanations. She called Sophie right there on the side of the highway, shaking with cold and adrenaline, and Sophie had answered immediately. I need you to book me a flight home, Emma had said. Today, right now, whatever's available. Sophie hadn't asked questions, had just said she'd take care of it, and Emma had stood on the shoulder watching traffic blur past while Daniel pleaded with her to be reasonable. A police car had pulled up, officer asking if everything was okay, and Emma had never been so grateful to see law enforcement in her life. She'd told the officer she needed to get back to Vancouver, that she was fine but needed distance from the man she was with. The officer had offered to call her a cab and wait with her, and Emma had accepted, watching Daniel's face cycle through emotions she couldn't read. When the cab arrived, Emma had gotten in without looking back, gave the driver Daniel's address, and sat in the back seat feeling like she was waking from a nightmare into a reality somehow worse than the dream. At the apartment, she'd packed everything she could fit into her suitcases with shaking hands, leaving behind anything that wouldn't fit. Sophie had texted that there was a flight at 10 that night, had already bought the ticket, and Emma had sobbed with relief. She'd called an Uber to the airport and was loading her bags when Daniel arrived. He'd tried again to explain, to minimize, to convince her she was overreacting. Said yes, technically he was still married, but it was over, had been over for years. Rachel meant nothing to him. Emma was who he loved, who he wanted to be with. Emma had stopped packing and looked at him clearly for the first time since the message from Rachel, seeing a stranger where she'd thought she'd known someone. Did you ever love me? She'd asked, and watched him hesitate just long enough to know the answer was no, or not the way he'd claimed, or not in any way that meant truth or respect or actual partnership. It doesn't matter, Emma had said, cutting off whatever lie he was preparing. I'm done. The Uber had arrived and Emma had left, not looking back at Daniel standing in the doorway, not letting herself feel anything but the desperate need to get home to Austin, to Sophie, to the life she should never have left. At the airport, she'd finally let herself cry, sitting at the gate surrounded by strangers, mourning not just the relationship but her own judgment, her own willingness to ignore instincts in favor of hope. The flight home was long, and Emma barely slept, running through everything she'd missed, all the red flags she'd explained away, all the moments her gut had told her something was wrong, and she'd dismissed it. Sophie was waiting at Austin arrivals with tears streaming down her face, and Emma had collapsed into her sister's arms and let herself be held, feeling safe for the first time in months. On the drive to Sophie's apartment, where Emma would stay until she figured out next steps, Sophie had asked only one question. Are you okay? And Emma had answered honestly, no, but I will be. What Emma didn't know as she fell asleep that night in Sophie's guest room, exhausted and heartbroken but blessedly safe, was that Daniel's lies had been even more extensive than she'd discovered. That Rachel wasn't just his wife, but a woman who'd been filing police reports about his behavior, about his control and manipulation, about his pattern of targeting vulnerable women and isolating them from support systems, that there was a file with the Vancouver Police Department with Daniel's name on it, complaints that hadn't yet reached the threshold for charges but were accumulating steadily, that Emma had escaped something far more dangerous than infidelity, had gotten out just before the cage Daniel was building around her had locked completely. But she also didn't know that Daniel wasn't done with her, that men like him don't accept endings they don't control, that her escape had been the beginning of something rather than the end. She didn't know that in 4 weeks, Daniel would show up in Austin claiming he'd left his wife for real this time, that he'd made a terrible mistake, that Emma was the only woman he'd ever truly loved. She didn't know that Sophie would call the police when he wouldn't leave their building, that there would be a restraining order, that Daniel's pattern was finally becoming visible to authorities. And she definitely didn't know that a year from now, a different woman would go missing in those same mountains where Emma had hiked, and that the search would uncover truths about Daniel Rousseau that would make Emma's near miss feel both terrifyingly close and impossibly lucky. For now, Emma slept in her sister's apartment and dreamed of mountains and cold and a man whose face she was already trying to forget. Tomorrow she would start rebuilding. Tomorrow she would begin to forgive herself for the mistake of trusting someone who'd proven himself unworthy. Tomorrow she would call a therapist and start the work of understanding how she'd gotten so lost. But tonight, she was just grateful to be home.